They must
स्टार्ट करो, कुछ भी बोल, दिमाग में कुछ नहीं है, कहाँ से लाएंगे?
I must have been the advocate. We must have been the advocates. She must have been the advocates. He must have been the advocates. They must have been the advocates. You must have been the advocate.
What she said, got it?
Yes, sir.
समझ में आ रहा है ना?
Yes, sir.
अब इस एग्जाम्पल को आपको अलग अलग एग्जाम्पल्स में अलग अलग सब्जेक्ट के साथ आपको यूज करना है, ठीक है ना? उसके बाद एक बार ये हो जाएगा, फिर आपका सिंगल सिंगल होने के बाद आप डबल डबल अपन कर लेंगे, राइट? चलो बोलो, तो जोर से बोलेगी।
I must have been a scientist.
साइंटिस्ट, ओके?
We must have been scientists. She must have been a scientist. He must have been a scientist. They must have been scientists. You must have been a scientist.
यू ऑलवेज रिमेंबर कि जहां बहुवचन होगा वहां पर आपको उस वर्ड का इस्तेमाल करना पड़ेगा, साइंटिस्ट्स बोलने हैं, और जहां सिंगुलर सब्जेक्ट रहेगा उसके साथ वैसा बोलना पड़ेगा, राइट? चलो पीछे से अजय।
I must have been spontaneous. We must have been affable. She must have been a driver of train. He must have been CM. They must have been PM. You must have been cardiologist.
ठीक है, ओके, सिट डाउन। यस प्रदीप।
I must have been a doctor. We must have been a singer. She must have been a football player. He must have been a chartered accountant. They must have been singers. You must have been a doctor.
डॉक्टर। सुमन।
I must have been a player. We must have been a player. She must have been a player. He must have been a player. They must have been a players. You must have been a player.
सिट डाउन। थोड़ा मिसिंग हो रहा है, प्लेयर्स बोलना जहाँ बहुवचन हो। यस फ्रांसिस।
I must have been a lawyer. We must have been a lawyer. She must have been a scientist of ISRO. He must have been the cardiologist. They must have been the ornithologist. You must have been the pilot.
सिट डाउन। बोलो अंजलि।
I must have been a doctor. He must be a doctor. She must be a doctor. He must be a doctor. They must be a doctors. You must be a doctor.
कहाँ भी है, कहाँ भी है? पूरा गलत सेंटेंस बोलिए, फिर से बोलो।
I must be.
हाँ, must have been।
I must have been a doctor.
हाँ,
We must be a.
फिर have लगाएगी ना।
We must have been a doctor. She must have been a doctor. He must have been a doctor. They must have been a doctor. Doctors. You must have been a doctor.
गुड, ओके, चलो प्रियंका।
I must have been a teacher. We must have been teacher. She must have been a teacher. He must have been a teacher. They must have been teacher. You must have been a teacher.
ओके, यस, चलो बोलो।
I must have been a nurse. We must have been a nurse. She must have been a nurse. He must have been a nurse. They must have been a nurse. You must have been a nurse.
बोलिए।
Sir, I must have been a IS officer. We must have been a scientist of ISRO. So We must have been a builder. He must have been a shopkeeper. We must have been a social worker. You must have been a student online.
ओके
Obvious student online.
चलो यू स्टार्ट बोलो आप बहादुर
I must have been an artist. We must have been an artist. She must have been an artist. He must have been an artist. They must have been an artist. You must have been an artist.
शाल
I must have been a cricketer. We must have been a doctor. She must have been a nurse. He must have been an engineer. They must have been an actors. You must have been a doctor.
Engineer. We must have been an engineer. She must have been an engineer. He must have been an engineer. They must have been an engineers. You must have been an engineers.
स्टार्ट कुछ भी बोल एक ही सेट है दिमाग में कुछ नहीं है कहाँ से लाएंगे इसको मतलब एक ही वर्ड को बोलो 6 बार में अलग अलग सब्जेक्ट के साथ मान लो डॉक्टर ही बोलना है ना आई मस्ट हैव बीन अ डॉक्टर वी मस्ट हैव बीन अ डॉक्टर शी मस्ट हैव बीन अ डॉक्टर वही बोलो बस सब्जेक्ट चेंज कर दो प्रैक्टिस करो थोड़ा लाउडली
I must have been a doctor. We must have been a doctor. She must have been a doctor. He must have been a doctor. They must have been a doctors. You must have been a doctor.
I must have been a judge. We must have been a judge. She must have been a judge. He must have been a judge. They must have been a judge. You must have been a judge.
I need to hear some words from your side. That's all. कुछ शब्द तुम्हारे मुंह से निकलने बहुत जरूरी है बोलो लाउडली
I must have been a teacher. We must have been a teacher. She must have been a teacher. He must have been a teacher. They must have been a teacher. You must have been a teacher.
who the rest one yeah speak up
I must have been an IS officer in Uti district. You must
have been
we have been
you must have been
we must have been software engineer. You must have been the artist. You must have been computer science teacher. They must have been
goldsmith okay
you must have been carpenter.
Vinoti
I must have been a social worker. We must have been a social worker. She must have been a social worker. He must have been a social worker. They must have been a social worker. You must have been a social worker.
sit down who the rest one try करो
I must have been an engineer. We must have been an engineer. She must have been an engineer. He must have been an engineer. They must have been an engineer. You must have been an engineer.
I must have been a singer. We must have been a singer. She must have been a singer. He you must have been a singer. There, they must have been a singer. You must have been a singer.
Sit down. Finish all?
Yes.
Okay. You will try. Rajiv? हैं? Okay. Look at me for some minutes. देखो यहाँ जहाँ बट कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं, ध्यान ये रखना जहाँ एक वचन रहेगा वहाँ ए लगाओगे, जहाँ बहुवचन रहेगा वहाँ आर लगाओगे। जैसे मान लो आई मस्ट हैव बीन अ डॉक्टर, चलो ठीक है, लेकिन वी मस्ट हैव बीन डॉक्टर्स होगा, ठीक है ना, वी इज अ प्लूरल सब्जेक्ट, तो वहां पर एस लग जाएगा। इस बात को आपको ध्यान को रखना है। तो ये एक तरीका है आपको बोलने का, आपकी प्रैक्टिस देखो। मस्ट हैव बीन माइंड पे आना चाहिए। मस्ट हैव बीन का सिंपल एग्जांपल अगर हम नाउन के साथ बनाए, आई मस्ट हैव बीन अ कार, यू मस्ट हैव बीन अ कार, यू मस्ट हैव बीन अ हाउस, कुछ भी एग्जांपल आप बना सकते हैं, राइट। तो एक बार मेरे साथ सब लोग बोलेंगे पीछे पीछे। She must have been a beautiful car.
She must have been a beautiful car.
They must have been beautiful cars.
They must have been beautiful cars.
You must have been a magnificent bungalow.
You must have been a magnificent bungalow.
She must have been a holy book.
She must have been a holy book.
We must have been the knowledge of English.
She must have been the knowledge of English.
They must have been the knowledge of science.
They must have been the knowledge of science.
My brother must have been the knowledge of playgrounds.
My brother must have been the knowledge of playground.
My younger sister must have the knowledge of sports.
My younger sister must have been the knowledge of sports.
My father must have sufficient money.
My father must have sufficient money.
You must have 3 pairs of shoes.
You must have 3 pairs of shoes.
You must have been the party wear.
You must have been the party wear.
You must have been a Twitter handle.
You must have been a Twitter handle.
You must have been a Facebook blog.
You must have been a Facebook blog.
My sister must have been a YouTube channel.
My sister must have been a YouTube channel.
India must have been atom bomb.
India must have been atom bomb.
Jharkhand must have been huge amount of minerals.
Jharkhand must have been
Huge amount of minerals मतलब बहुत ज्यादा मात्रा में क्या है, मिनरल्स अवश्य होना चाहिए था। So this is the way to practice a lot. माइटर अपना बढ़िया से प्रैक्टिस आपको करना है, बोल बोल के प्रैक्टिस करना है, बार बार प्रैक्टिस करना है। आप जितना बार आप करेंगे उतना बार आपकी प्रैक्टिस बढ़ती चली जाएगी, and then you will be able to speak in English very well. I don't think so even a single person who is sitting in front of the classroom and in the classroom can speak English very well. But one thing is very important: focused and consistency. Focused and consistency. Make a goal first and then continuous practice. This practice can change your each and everything, your lifestyle, your way of speaking, each and everything. So get ready.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So you will write something, some examples I'm giving you for homework. Come on, everybody. Today we have completed must, all the series of must. आज हम लोगों ने सारा must का सारे नियम को पढ़े। 13 टाइप के रूल्स मैंने आपको दिखाया। ये 14 मतलब आज मस्ट के सारे सब्जेक्ट जितने भी टाइप के यूज किए जा सकते हैं वो उसमें आपको पीएचडी मैंने करा दिया। पीएचडी समझते हो ना? एवरीथिंग जो मस्ट से बन सकता है वो सारे एग्जांपल आपके सामने हैं। आप लोग आराम से इसको बार-बार बनाइए, प्रैक्टिस करिए। कम ऑन, राइट डाउन। किसी भी सूरत में देखो, किसी भी सूरत में गांव वालों के पास, किसी भी सूरत में गांव वालों के पास अनाज उगाने के लिए जमीन होना चाहिए था। किसी भी सूरत में गांव वालों के पास अनाज उगाने के लिए जमीन होना चाहिए था।